Was the first OSC to show up on the site. I expected to see a lot of oil when I got here, and I did. And actually, there was no water in the creek when I showed up. It was oil. It was straight black crude oil, and it was rolling like a whitewater river, but in a creek. This is a major spill. There's a lot of oil out there.
This is what we would call a type 1 event, very major release of contamination. EPA's primary role in this response is to direct the cleanup activities that Enbridge is responsible for performing. While there are a number of agencies with a high degree of interest in this incident and lots of participation, ultimately EPA is charged with making sure that the cleanup happens the way that it needs to.
What you have with the Kalamazoo River system is a great resource for recreation. A lot of dollars come into our counties because people from all over the state of Michigan come to utilize this river, and it's a huge benefit to our community. The minute people heard that the EPA was coming in to take care of this, it relieved people. You could see people's shoulders relax. So it's been a huge benefit.
On July 27th, the state of Michigan posted swimming, boating, and fish consumption advisories from the release site downstream to Morrow Lake. Calhoun County also issued a voluntary evacuation of 61 homes near the spill site and a bottled water advisory for residents with private wells within 200 feet of the creek and river.
Well, I think it's had a significant impact on all of the residents in the community, and obviously this is the largest contamination spill that we've dealt with as a state. There's been a lot of concern relative to air quality, groundwater quality, home values. So I think that to varying degrees, everyone has had an impact as a result of the incident.
In the area of the spill itself, the wildlife that we see being impacted is those that were directly touched by the oil. And so we're seeing a lot of turtles, mallards, Canada geese. Those are the primary species groups that have been impacted the most.
This spill, because it happened during a high water event, had the opportunity to spread out across floodplains and critical wetland areas.
We also see the effects on the vegetation and the plant life along the river that's been oiled, and it's going to have to be removed. I think certainly the authority that the EPA brings to the incident is a major factor in getting the responsible party to respond properly. I think that's been the major factor in directing the work and making it a priority.
It's EPA's responsibility to make certain that a responsible party like Enbridge has the right assets deployed. US EPA has deployed a number of our assets, including many OSCs, to not only work with Enbridge in the operations center, but also be the eyes and ears in the field overseeing the work that Enbridge and their contractors are doing along the river.
Plus, we mobilized probably the biggest core of START responders, our Superfund technical assessment teams that we've done in our history in the region, all at one time. They are responsible for air monitoring. They're responsible for environmental sampling. They're responsible for assisting EPA and conducting responsible party contractor oversight. They're responsible for documentation. They're responsible for oversight of health and safety. Our START contractors now take on roles in the incident command system as well.
To contain and reclaim the oil, responders utilized an arsenal of site-specific recovery and removal techniques. Near the release site and in some wetlands, excavators and crews physically removed affected vegetation and soil. Along the creek, river, and wetlands, containment booms directed oil to collection points where skimmers separated oil from the water. Vacuum trucks then pumped oil from the skimmers or directly from waterways. A variety of shape-absorbent booms were also utilized to soak up oil. At some remote locations, teams using low-pressure, high-volume hoses flushed oil from vegetation and shorelines for collection downstream. To free oil entrained in sediment for surface collection, teams employed mechanical aeration techniques. In areas with the heaviest concentrations of submerged oil, a hydraulic dredge removed, then pumped the contaminated sediment onshore for dewatering, treatment, and transportation.
We have divided up the incident into two branches, one being east, one being west. The east branch includes A and B, which is the Talmadge Creek and the pipeline release. There are a number of activities going on there: excavation of contaminated soil, use of both skimmers, back trucks, and a lot of soil work. And then the west branch includes C, D, and E, which is the Kalamazoo River, all the way to the Lake Moeller. And there's a lot of contaminated vegetation in that area. There's a lot of boom deployed, more than 80,000 feet of boom, both containment and sorbent deployed out there. And the operation is broken down again into collection points that are monitored both by Enbridge and EPA.
We kind of drew a line in the sand, or in this case, the sediment, to make sure that oil did not impact Morrow Lake. EPA began doing multiple flyovers initially on Morrow Lake to make sure sheen hadn't gotten down there. Then we actually put some standing teams down at Morrow Lake to go on sheen patrol, if you will, to constantly look and collect sheen if it's not near our final containment structures just upstream of Morrow Lake.
To help verify conditions at Morrow Lake, EPA utilized the Mud Puppy 2 research vessel to collect water and sediment samples. Managing an army of over 2,000 responders requires efficient structure. As part of the National Response Framework, EPA leads the National Incident Command System during an inland oil spill.
The Unified Command is at the top of the organizational structure that was set up to manage the response. It consists of those local, state, and federal agencies with the most jurisdiction and resource deployment on the incident. In this case, we have also elected to include Enbridge in the Unified Command since it has the most responsibility for deploying resources to respond to the incident.
For Region 5, this is one of our first big incidents utilizing Incident Command System. It's working very well. Early in the incident, we did implement the planning process. That started with having the Command and General Staff meetings, the Unified Command meetings, progressing around the planning cycle. And now we're really into a routine of folks know what to expect with the daily meetings and establishing the objectives and navigating that planning process.
The cause of the spill is under investigation by EPA, the U.S. Department of Transportation Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, and the National Transportation Safety Board. The federal government intends to seek full reimbursement of cleanup costs from Enbridge.
I think that the concerns that we'll still face is will the company actually carry through on what it's vowed to do? So far, its track record is very good. We have no doubt that the EPA and the other agencies will carefully monitor and will step up to make requirements where it's necessary.
We're pretty much determined we don't want to see oil flowing in that pipeline until we know what the problem is, that it's not epidemic in the rest of the line. I believe that between the NTSB and the EPA's investigations that won't happen until we're sure that line is capable of flowing with zero incidents like this.
People were at first very angry. I think they were frightened about the implications of the spill, as you would expect. They wanted information. They wanted to know how they could help. And people have stepped forward and volunteered in all kinds of different ways.
Hundreds of volunteers called to assist wildlife rehabilitation teams. Locals also organized a donation center for materials to to help care for over 2,700 oil birds and animals.
Enbridge brought in a company called Focus Wildlife that have worked internationally on responding to oiled birds and spills. It's a basically state-of-the-art rehabilitation center with all the waste handling capability that you need to run a center like this. When birds are first brought to the Wildlife Response Center where the rehabilitation is going on, the first thing that has to happen is getting the birds medically stabilized. Once the birds are strong enough, then they can start the wash process. It's a whole team of folks that work to wash each individual bird feather by feather in order to remove the oil so that when the birds are clean again, they can preen and restore the structure of the feathers. And then they go into another quiet area to recover from that process before they're moved into the conditioning pens where they have pools of water and perching areas and loafing areas. And they're held there until they're ready for release. Binder Park Zoo and their veterinarians have been taking care of the turtles in the rehabilitation center. The turtles are washed once to get the gross contamination off of them, but the crews have often ended up washing the same turtle 2 or 3 times in order to get into all the folds and areas where the turtles have gotten oiled.
On September 17th, the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration permitted Enbridge to gradually restart the repaired and tested pipeline. As of the fall of 2010, over 90,000 cubic yards of contaminated soil and debris were collected. Shorelines were cleaned, reconstructed, and revegetated. Over 13 million gallons of oil water mixture was disposed, and over 760,000 gallons of oil were recovered.
Regional administrators typically don't get directly involved in spill response, but the administrator asked me specifically to come out here, and it has been great to see Region 5 and all of the other regions who have stepped forward to help to see their performance, because that's what we.
Good morning. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for the second of our 2 webinars exploring the consequences of the 2010 Enbridge oil spill in the Kalamazoo River and Talmadge Creek. My name is Jeff Insko. I'm a board member with the Pipeline Safety Trust. I also happen to live along the route of Line 6B, which traverses my backyard in North Oakland County, a couple of hours east of the spill site. Before we begin this morning, I just want to take a brief moment to acknowledge that the spill occurred on the ceded lands of the Ottawa, Chippewa, and Potawatomi peoples, the 3 Algonquin nations that first inhabited and cared for the land that we'll be discussing today. So it's just about a minute after 11:17, which was the precise time 10 years ago, almost to the day, when the spill was finally discovered by a local utility worker 17 hours after Line 6B ruptured. And 17 hours ago, in real time, in yesterday's webinar, our Deputy Director, Bill Karam, led a discussion about some of the national consequences of the spill. Today, we're going to be focusing on more local issues with our knowledgeable panelists. I'll give brief introductions to them in turn, but you can read their full bios at the PST website with the link that was sent to all registrants. But so we'll be talking about the cleanup, the current state of the river, the spill's effects upon local residents, and also a couple of issues that, in my view, have, even to this day, still not received sufficient attention. And those are the public health effects of the spill and also the spill's impacts upon local indigenous groups. And I suppose, inevitably, I'm sure we'll also get to Line 5 and related matters as well. So that's a full agenda. So let's go ahead and get started. A brief word about the format. We'll begin with 5-minute or so presentations from each of our panelists. Then we'll have 30 minutes of moderated Q&A. And then we're going to turn it over for the last 30 minutes to audience submitted questions. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce quickly Ralph Dollhopf, who's the on-site coordinator, has been the on-site coordinator for the Environmental Protection Agency since the time of the spill. Ralph, welcome.
Thank you, Jeff, and good morning to all in the audience. Throughout the years, I've been asked many times whether the Enbridge spill was the largest inland spill in U.S. history, and every time I go to answer that, I have to explain that it's more complicated than that. Certainly, it was large in the context of volume. We estimate over 1 million gallons were spilled. It was certainly large in the context of geographic impact. It affected over 40 miles of river. It was extremely complex because of the nature of the oil that was spilled. It was actually more akin to a hazardous chemical than an oil, as we learned shortly after responding to the scene. And the whole entirety of the incident was exacerbated by extreme weather conditions that were occurring at the time of the spill. There was a major flood occurring. The river was over its banks into the floodplains, and that was a major factor in the distribution of the oil and the impacts to the environment as well as to public health. So it was an epic incident in that regard. And another high level takeaway for us and for all of you is, as Jeff mentioned, the public health impacts of the spill. So often when we think about oil spills, we think only about the environmental outcomes. And historically, even in the field of oil spill response, there generally, historically, has not been as much emphasis on public health impacts as there are just mopping up the oil and cleaning up wildlife. This was different, and it was apparent to us early on July 26th when we responded that there was something different about this oil, and we immediately had to get into a mode of protecting public health and as well as worker safety by monitoring and sampling air, which was so much an issue. And perhaps we'll talk more about that throughout the presentation today, but air was an issue. Drinking water concerns were apparent, agricultural issues, and certainly recreational contact with the river. So lots of public health ramifications. Then on top of that, it became obvious to us within a few days that the recovery of this oil was going to be a challenge that like none that we had ever faced. I'll never forget the day, it was probably the second week of our response when some of our very experienced oil behavior specialists who were out on the river came back into the command post and sat down with me and said, you know, yesterday there was quite a bit of oil here and quite a bit of oil there. We thought we were making progress. Today we went out and it's gone. It's just gone, and we're kind of at a loss. And that was the moment when it dawned upon all of us that the oil had been in the water and on the water long enough. It had weathered, and the volatile diluent portion of it had evaporated, if you will, and the heavy residual had sunk to the bottom of the river. And that set the stage for the next 4 years of figuring out where that oil was in the bottom of the river, because we could not see it. And the development of all the scientific approaches that were needed to follow it, to figure out where it was, to try to recover it, to then reiterate that from one season to the next. And that brings me to another high-level takeaway, which was the importance of science when it came to a successful conclusion to this spill. We had to develop these techniques for identifying the oil, chasing it, and recovering it that were not in the book at the time. This was not a situation that we were aware that anyone else had encountered. So beyond that, and I'll get more into that into more detail if there are questions. Response organization was paramount. We had to organize over 2,000 responders, and that was no easy task, but we figured out how to do that in an effective way. And one of the other major takeaways is the importance of contingency planning. Looking back, it was clear to us that had there been more contingency planning at the state, local, and federal level, which also would have included the Indian tribes, that would have likely resulted in less impact, earlier detection, and even more expedient launch of the process. So there's a lot there, but I want to limit my opening remarks to the 5 minutes, and I'll be happy to get into that more as we continue. Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you so much, Ralph. Lots to discuss there, and we get to lots of those questions. So up next, I'd like to introduce Kenneth Kornheiser, who is the Board Vice President for the Kalamazoo River Watershed Council. Welcome, Kenneth.
Hi. So I am a retired clinical veterinarian. I do not have water resource technical expertise, but I have been involved with watershed protection activities for over 25 years. Because of that, I was aware of the problem very quickly, and also because since 1999, I have been a paddler on the Kalamazoo River, going maybe once or twice a week for 6 months of the year. So I have literally been on the Kalamazoo River stretch where the oil spill occurred hundreds of times, literally. And the only time I haven't paddled it in the last 20 years is when it was blocked off because there was an oil spill, or there was some kind of recovery of oil efforts or restoration efforts, and portions of the river were blocked off from the public. In 2013, I started sitting at the conference table of the oil spill stakeholders, and so had immediate access to those people who did have technical expertise and were operating in order to deal with the oil spill. And in 2014, I joined the Kalamazoo River Watershed Council, which is the recognized watershed council for the entire Kalamazoo River watershed. I became president of the Kalamazoo River Watershed Council in 2016 and just stepped down at the beginning of this year, although I stayed on as vice president. I just was tired of being the chief administrator of this. So in any event, I've had intimate knowledge of the oil spill area and the Kalamazoo River for a long time by being on the water, and would probably be here more as a representative of the citizenry and those people who enjoy the river directly.
Terrific. Thanks, Kenneth. Let's turn now to Mike Muller from Enbridge. He is the director of the Great Lakes region for Enbridge, Inc. Good to have you here, Mike.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff, and thanks to the entire Pipeline Safety Trust for allowing my participation in this very important discussion. So, as mentioned, I'm the Director of Field Operations for our Great Lakes region in Liquids Pipelines of Enbridge. I've worked at Enbridge for over 23 years. That region today that I'm in leadership roles is all of Michigan, Northern Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and a little bit in New York. I have a responsibility for the safe and reliable operations of all of our LP assets, and I'm supported by a couple hundred dedicated employees and contract resources, the lion's share of which live in the lower peninsula of Michigan. I was on site 10 years ago spent months there in the command center working with Ralph and others and witnessed that devastation that we had caused, and we had just seen again in that video that played at the opening of the conference here. The effect that it had on the residents, the community, the river, the animals was horrific and gut-wrenching to me. And it's in that context that I'd like to discuss, you know, accountability, Enbridge today, and the river itself. Accountability was taken by Enbridge right away. The CEO at the time gave a very simple commitment to the community that we will make this right. He turned that internal to us employees and said, we will do what it takes to make it right, which really served as a simple yet profound rallying cry to all of us on the ground and back in head office to ensure that that's what happened. And while our response didn't only include cleaning up the river, we also launched a community response with the goal of taking care of all those residents that were affected. Enbridge did the likes of relocating people, ensuring they had a place to stay, meals, water, that sort of thing. We opened up a community center in both Battle Creek and Marshall to have a touch point with the community for claims to come in. We offered up to buy affected homes in the area. While about 300 might have been eligible, I think about half of them opted in to that opportunity. And we're very precise in how we put those back on the market as to not disturb the local market, housing market in the communities. You know, and I think a decade reserved from the incident, many of our employees have crossed the threshold into retirement or pursued other efforts. And, you know, as my role as region director, I think one of the most important responsibilities I have is taking that knowledge, that gut wrench that I had when I was on site day 2 through the first 3 months on site, and instilling that into the new team members that come to us at Enbridge. Enbridge today, again, as painful as it was to all involved, the residents, especially the local communities, the responders, it did shape us what we are today. I know Mike talked yesterday about some large integrity programs and control center improvements and training and the like. But one of the hardest lessons that we learned was the ensuring that we know the communities in which we operate. Not only do we know the communities, but those communities know us. They know who we are. They know our names. They know that they can call us anytime. My role as region director in Great Lakes today, greatly different than my role as a region director in North Dakota at the time of the incident. Nowadays, I spend a majority of my week externally focused. I travel to, well, when travel restrictions were not on, I travel to Michigan on a near weekly basis, and again, have a very large part of my work week externally focused, again, building those relationship with community members, tribal, state, and local officials. In fact, today we have 3 employees in my region alone on the ground building those relationships, and are supported by a whole complement of people back in head office. We've got multiple emergency response dedicated people in the region today. And you know, I think the river and the Talmadge Creek today, we took the accountability to make it right as we committed to, and we certainly did not do that alone. Federal agencies, Ralph and the EPA, state agencies, the Department of Environmental Quality, now EGLE, the DNR, health districts, county officials, emergency management, state police, all those people helped pull the rope on the same end to get this to where it is today. And a huge thanks to those people, as well as all those in the community for getting there today. But, you know, I think for all that effort, the river is clean today. It's vibrant, it's accessible. There's more access points on that river now than there was then. And a simple drive through there this time of year will tell you that there's more people using that river. So I think that really is proof in the pudding of the efforts by all involved there. And we will continue to engage in any potential issues that arise in the creek, the source area, or the river, and look forward to doing that. So in summary, Jeff, the learnings from the Marshall incident have made an enduring imprint on the company, me as a leader within Enbridge, and again, a strong safety culture to building those community relationships is a lesson learned that is near and dear to our heart and can never be forgotten. So I know there's time for Q&A, and I'll yield until then, Jeff. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you, Mike. We'll certainly have occasion to talk more about the state of the river. But now I'm pleased to introduce you my wonderful colleague at Oakland University, Mozhgon Rajaee. She's an assistant professor of public health. Good to have you here, Mozhgon.
Thank you, and thanks everyone for being here. Yeah, so I wasn't involved in the spill at the time in 2010. And my kind of, what I'm bringing today is looking at it from a public health lens, and particularly an environmental health lens. And I want to talk about what those implications for oil spills and health impacts are. And the reality is there's a significant lack of data that exists. Much of the data we have on health impacts of oil spills generally are on short-term impacts to both workers and community residents. Some work that was done by the State Health Department in Michigan found headaches, nausea, respiratory and eye irritation, anxiety, right? Things that we typically see and kind of expect. What we don't know is what are the long-term impacts of exposure to these chemicals from oil spills. Most of that research has focused on workers and not the general public. So research that is focused on the general public has primarily almost exclusively been short-term. Some of that short-term work is on workers who have been involved in cleanup procedures, and so their exposures. There has been a little bit of long-term research looking at workers involved in cleanup, and that's primarily come out of the Gulf oil spill, the Deep Horizon one in 2010 also. But the reality is we can't use studies with workers and compare them to the general population. And there's two reasons mainly for that. The first is that they are exposed to more of the chemicals than the general population are. So in that case, if you are seeing health effects in workers, it doesn't mean we're going to see it in the general population. So they're different, right? The exposures are different. But the other layer is that workers tend to be healthier than the general population, right? You don't get someone who has severe asthma leading oil cleanup. They're not going to do that. And so the vulnerabilities that the general population comes with, you're not going to see usually as frequently or at all in workers. So it's not easy to compare a working population with the general public. On top of that, the oil spill in the Gulf was not the same type of oil, right? You don't have the same crude oil, the diluted bitumen, and it's also a completely different setting, right, on the coast. And the reality is we haven't had any long-term research on the health impacts of heavy crude oil, this diluted bitumen, even with cleanup workers. So we haven't had it with the general public long-term study or workers. And so there's a lot of unknowns on what the health impacts are. And it makes it really difficult to really understand and say for sure with any certainty what the impacts might be. Knowing these risks are important. We don't know always, and often we don't have the makeup of the chemicals in the crude oil mixtures. And so we need better transparency on what are the chemicals that are in them, what's the concentrations, the makeup of the mixtures. All of that is important so we can break down what chemicals are going to be the risks for residents or workers involved in oil spills. Knowing those risks are important because the question of evacuation comes up. And this came up also in Marshall. We don't know if we should evacuate people if we don't know the risks with those chemicals. And so knowing those risks is really important. And we don't have good data on that. The other thing I think goes beyond the scope of this panel, but I'd be remiss to not mention it, is while we're focusing on oil spills, I think we have to look at pipeline safety in the larger situation, right? The before and after of the pipeline, which is the oil extraction, as well as the refinement of particularly heavy crude oil. And typically what we see is, well, the oil that's in line 6 is largely coming from the Athabasca oil sands in Canada and Alberta. A lot of this oil extraction is located near First Nations communities. On the tail end, you have refining operations that are disproportionately located in communities of color, low-income communities. And so you end up having these environmental justice issues that also come up at these, right, the extraction and the refinement portion of the oil. Why I bring this up is because there's a lack of research that exists even at those tail ends. So we don't have data on what are the health impacts of oil spills, right, in the longer term. What we could be doing is looking at what's going on in extraction and what's going on in refinement. And we don't have a lot of good data on that, and that's partially because these are marginalized communities. And I think having that type of research would be beneficial because you don't want to wait until you have an oil spill to then study the impacts, right? Because at that point, you're too late to really do anything about it. And so I think there's a need for more research to understand what the health impacts are. And that's really something that becomes apparent when we try and understand what are the health impacts that residents faced, that the community faced from this spill. And we'll hopefully talk about that more in the Q&A.
Thanks so much, Mozhgon. And a nice segue to our next guest panelist, Jaynan Montague, who was a displaced resident following the spill and now has the a pleasure to live in beautiful Holland, Michigan. I'm jealous. Welcome, Jaynan.
Hi. Yes, it is beautiful here. I lived with my family on Talmadge Creek from 1973 to 2010. Our family was raised there. We had graduation open houses there. And it was just a normal day. And I smelled what was happening. And I went down to our creek and it was devastating. I have a list here that I wrote in September of 1910. And it was things that Enbridge has taken away, which is a little dramatic, but really not at all. We lost our home. We lost our sense of security. We really lost our privacy. We lost our peace of mind. We lost our view of the natural creek. We lost time. So many details to moving. We had not moved since 1973. It was not our choice to move. We lost freedom to move about our property. I was told by a security guard that you can't come down here without a helmet, and I'm not giving you mine. Every social event, Enbridge was the topic, sort of like COVID is the topic now. We had difficulty sleeping. There were financial worries. We were one of them since we were right on the creek, pretty much ground zero. We did take Enbridge up on their offer to buy our home. And it was market value, not replacement value, but it turned out okay in the end, I guess. We lost fresh air, we lost our routine, and we lost our anonymity. We're both pretty quiet people, or our family, and everybody knew us. You couldn't go anywhere without somebody saying, what's going on at your house? I self-evacuated. I had the cottage here in Holland. So I left, and my sister was driving down I-69 and called me and said, what is going on at your house? So I went home and I stayed one night. We had 2 driveways, and the one right by our bedroom had a semi running all night long. And I understand they were cleaning it up, but there, you know, the lack of privacy, the lack of sleep. It didn't have to happen. And I pray that it doesn't happen again. And it's a kick in the gut every time I think of the beautiful Straits of Mackinac with that aged, I'm 65. So that pipeline under the Straits of Mackinac is as old as I am. And I know, and I just can't fathom what would happen. And I don't want to. Thank you.
Thank you, Jaynan. Okay, up next is Beth Wallace. She is the Great Lakes Freshwater Campaign Manager for the National Wildlife Federation. Nice to have you here, Beth.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here and have this discussion with all of you, many of whom I've worked with for years. I remember when I first heard about the spill, it was a blip story on NPR. I was heading to work, but what caught me off guard and what caught my attention was that the spill happened in my backyard where I grew up. I grew up in Athens, a small community just off of Battle Creek, where the Kalamazoo runs. That afternoon, as the news grew more alarming, a coworker and I decided to head to Marshall. You know, the National Wildlife Federation at the time was playing a key role in the Gulf oil spill as a watchdog in response. And so we thought perhaps there might be a role for us in this response as well. As we were nearing Marshall, the smell hit us like a ton of bricks. We were still miles away from the river, but the smell was so strong. And we exchanged concerns at that moment for our safety. We were arriving in the river and it was unbearable to breathe. We were shocked and confused to see a lack of response, no boom, no cleanup. The only indication of a spill was a cobbled together sign that told people to call a number and report issues or concerns. The river was thick, black, running fast, and the shoreline and vegetation was completely covered. At this point, it was nearly 24 hours after lines had ruptured. Moments after arriving, we heard and saw a desperate muskrat soaked in oil, trying to clean itself. It kept getting in and out of the river, washing oil off, only to re-oil itself over and over again. When I tried calling the number on the sign, there was no answer. I couldn't even leave a message. We were at a complete loss in that moment, and we knew we needed to get involved. NWF became a leading watchdog NGO responding to this disaster for years to come. We started out with a focus on wildlife and natural resource impacts, but that quickly turned into years of advocacy for citizens' health and pipeline safety reform as we witnessed the infamous Keystone Cop response that Enbridge had and the overwhelming health impacts that citizens are still trying to understand, including mental health from their homes, communities, businesses, and environment being completely destroyed. This disaster also made us pause and consider what other pipelines throughout the Great Lakes might be of concern, and we were shocked to learn that Enbridge operates the largest network of tar sands pipelines throughout the world, throughout the Great Lakes, including one that's nearly 70-year-old that sits in the open waters of the Great Lakes for 4 miles at the Straits of Mackinac called Line 5. I have now spent the last 10 years of my life, both personally and professionally, dedicated to this issue, and my goal is to prevent another tragedy. But yet, here we are over and over again, hearing of similar ruptures that continue to happen, including on Enbridge's own pipelines. Through our work, we are fighting for strict pipeline oversight, improved transparency, and environmental protection. It shouldn't be this hard, yet it is, and it must get better. And I look forward to this conversation, but I always wish it was under different circumstances. But I hope that our continued work to remember this disaster will prevent additional communities, wildlife, and waterways from being destroyed. Thanks for again including me, and I look forward to talking with all of you.
Great, thanks so much, Beth. And so finally, our late arrival, the much in demand Kyle Whyte, who is the professor and Timnick Chair of Philosophy at Michigan State University. It's great to have you here, Kyle. Welcome.
Great, and it's good to be here. Thanks for having me. And I was actually able to listen to most of the brief presentations on the participant link. And I wanted to share a couple of remarks. I'm Potawatomi and a member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation, and we're obviously closely related to the Potawatomi of people living in Michigan today. And the issues with the pipeline are ones that are very close to my heart. And one of the things that I wanted to recount was that around the time that it happened, I was working on an environmental justice initiative with some folks in the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality. And I remember one of the persons working for the state had told me that he was sort of unclear exactly how the spill would affect some of the tribal jurisdictions that were nearby, right? And I remember when this person was explaining it to me, I was struck by the fact that they didn't really have any idea of what indigenous homeland is, what tribal homelands are, and was extremely puzzled by the different types of land claims and the different areas in the region that indigenous people exercise stewardship responsibilities over. And it just struck me that there really isn't a lot of understanding still as to the significance of indigenous land. So what I wanted to discuss, right, is that for Potawatomi people, we were all over this place for generations. If some of you all look at those older maps or historic references about just how many communities and villages we had, and as Anishinaabe people, we were closely connected to a number of other peoples and communities throughout the Great Lakes region. And so this area for us historically is extremely rich and forms the cornerstone of our sovereignty and our self-determination as Potawatomi people today. And I think when folks talk about, for example, the cleanup of a spill, I don't think that's really the right language, because to clean something up in some ways suggests that for everybody in the region, the situation from the very beginning was one that was normal. And Potawatomi people, like other indigenous people, have been widely dispossessed of our lands and have had to fight against a number of environmental issues. And so at the time that the spill occurred, I don't think any Potawatomi person would have thought that that was already a normal situation. The spill had created issues on top of generations of issues that Native people were fighting to deal with. And I think for, especially the two tribes, right, the Matchubi-Nashuish Potawatomi and Nottawasipi Potawatomi, they're both attempting in their programs and projects, and I encourage folks to review the information that those tribes have put out publicly, right? But they're both trying to engage in remediation issues, but also trying to strengthen their capacity to support their members' cultures, their traditions, their harvesting activities in this larger area that we were dispossessed of. So the homeland area is not just the trust lands or, it's the total area that's significant to us, which is the entire region. And I think as Native people, we're trying to strengthen, restore, and establish stronger senses of community. And so I hope that at least one thing that might have come out of this, and I'm not convinced that this has happened, is that people who are concerned about the pipeline have learned a little bit more about what indigenous homelands are, how big they are, and that it's more than just the trust lands. it's more than just the reservation boundaries. It's the ancestral areas, the treaty areas, the areas that our ancestors were significantly acquainted with. And this has also been an issue tied to other pipelines with respect to the resistance against the Dakota Access Pipeline, which again, the people that made some of the poor decisions about how to evaluate and assess the pipeline really did not have an understanding of some of these different conceptions of indigenous peoples' lands and what mattered to members of the Standing Rock tribe and other Oceti Sakowin people. Anyways, miigwech, and good to have a chance to share with you all.
Kyle, thanks so much. That's great, and thanks everyone for the opening remarks. And I think we've got a lot to talk about. And I think that maybe I'd like to begin the kind of moderated questions by picking up on some of what Kyle has talked about. And so I want to ask Kyle maybe if he could speak a little bit more specifically about the use of the river for the bands nearby in particular. And then I'm wondering if maybe it's a good opportunity for Mike to talk a little bit about the way that Enbridge has worked with some of the tribal groups and has hopefully begun to learn about the kinds of questions of sovereignty and ancestral land use and dispossession that Kyle has spoken about that are an important part of this conversation. So Kyle, if you could maybe say a few words specifically about the relationship to the river for the bands in the region.
Sure, and I'd encourage folks, to also look up some of these publicly available resources that both the Nottawasipi and Matchibi-Nashuish Potawatomi tribes have made available. If you look up their natural resource or environmental programs or cultural programs, I think there's a lot of great information out there that they have sought to make available for everybody. What I'd like to just discuss in relation to that is I think there's a lot of misunderstanding from folks about just how sensitive many of us are to issues that have to do with water. For Anishinaabe people, again, of which Potawatomi are an important part, respect for water and taking care of water isn't just a value that we have to be sustainable, but it's actually even tied to our gender system. As Anishinaabe people, we had a very open and fluid gender system that also recorded respect for people in their gender identities and was extremely devoted to acknowledging the importance that people of all genders play, and in particular people who today I think would identify as women were stewards and caretakers of water. And in the history of colonialism in the United States, one of the most painful parts of it was the introduction of sexism and gender-based discrimination into our communities. And so anything that affects water is tied to that insult and is tied to that memory and that trauma. And so Native people, whether it's through ceremonies or other caretaking or harvesting practices, have so many different connections to water. I just gave one example. And so anything that affects water quality, anything that affects the flow of water, and as a lot of Anishinaabe people would say, the personalities of different bodies of water, of rivers and lakes is huge for us. And in areas like the Kalamazoo River and the larger watershed, there are important initiatives for restoring and protecting practices to wild rice, to sturgeon, to numerous other traditional species that are relevant to Anishinaabe people. And especially with respect to wild rice, I was particularly troubled by the fact that the impacts to wild rice were part of what happened, because for a lot of tribes in in Michigan, and there's a book by Barb Barton that documents some of the history of wild rice that you can find online in Michigan. A lot of Potawatomi, but also other Anishinaabe tribes were really trying to restore the practice of wild ricing. You know, I've worked up in with Anishinaabe people in what's currently Minnesota and Wisconsin, where there's a lot more areas in which wild rice was accessible. But down here, we were really trying to work hard and in terms of restoring and maintaining some of those traditions with wild rice. And they were at some crucial stages. And I think it was particularly disturbing, whether it's for the youth or for elders, that there was a threat to wild rice. And I know that with some of the current remediation funding that Matchiubinashuish and Nottawassipi are both engaged in different dimensions of wild rice conservation in the wake of the spill. But that in particular was just a huge blow because it is a sacred food. It's central to community building and to ceremonial practices. And again, we were working very, very hard, especially folks in those two tribes, but also other Anishinaabe people in the state, to try to really bring back those traditions and practice them to their fullest.
Thanks, Kyle. I mean, Mike, would you like to speak a little bit to Enbridge's relationship with some of the tribal groups in the area?
Sure, thanks, Jeff, and thanks, Kyle. We, again, another lesson learned. Trust was absolutely eroded with the tribal communities in this event, and we know that trust is only earned. It is not granted. And to that end, I can talk a little bit about my personal journey along with Enbridge's journey. Being relatively new back to the Great Lakes region a couple of years ago, we have engaged in several conversations with Anishinaabe people, participated in several wisdom circles. I and about 3 dozen of our employees took a Anishinaabe cultural course. And in my work in the Great Lakes Basin, I've been very, very fortunate enough to actually take that, if you will, theoretical course and see it in practice as I've met many Waganuk. Those are the pipe carriers, those folks that are held with the cultural and spiritual leadership of their tribal people. And I must tell one story, Jeff, and that's around a Anishinaabe elder, as I was in a wisdom circle talking of what Kyle alluded to. My education in North America did not include a lot of, well, didn't include any cultural awareness of the Anishinaabe or other indigenous peoples. And as I was mentioning that to the elders in the circle, I said, I start from a place of ignorance. And a most profound aspect of my 23 years, a elder from the Anishinaabe community bestowed an immense amount of grace to me and said, Mike, you don't come from a point of ignorance, you come from a point of innocence. So Enbridge and I myself are on a journey away from innocence, in discussions with the 12 tribes, and specifically some of these wisdom circles and Waganuk pipe carriers, and have seen the beautiful ceremonies that Kyle alluded to, whether it's the 4 sacred medicines. And the other thing I would say that we've learned greatly is that in the context of our corporate values of integrity, respect, and safety, and the 7 grandfather teachings of the Anishinaabe people, you can have robust discussions, and there's all kinds of room for disagreement. But in the context of the Anishinaabe 7 grandfather teachings and our corporate values, you absolutely can have, you absolutely have more agreement than disagreement when it comes to protection of the water and understanding, a desire to learn the culture and understand, so that as we make decisions as a company going forward, we have that in our mindset as we make those decisions. So it is absolutely a journey. We are talking with tribal folks, and I thoroughly enjoy being able to talk to those elders and other community members. And I'm just overwhelmed with the opportunity to learn their culture and background.
Thanks, Mike. I want to take a minute to kind of circle back, and I know we've got at least one audience question related to this discussion, but I'd like to circle back for a minute to some of the beginning part of our conversation. Both Ralph and Mozhgon mentioned a particular type of oil that was spilled in the Kalamazoo River, and I wonder if we could talk a little bit about whether the type of oil made a difference in the impacts of the spill and the cleanup, and if so, what rules have changed regarding spill preparedness for pipelines that carry this type of heavy crude? And you know, I suppose a number of you could probably speak to that. So, and we maybe start with Ralph.
Sure. So the oil that was discharged in Marshall was a blend of what's called Dilbet, which is also known as the tar sands oil, or the oil sands oil from Canada, and a more volatile, lighter fraction known as the diluent. And that is the part that created the public health issues. As the oil traveled down Talmadge Creek into the river and got battered by the high floodwaters and all of the turbulence, and as some of you may recall, extremely high temperatures in the 90s, it began to weather. And that weather caused, accelerated the volatilization. That's what ultimately caused the oil to sink. And the air impacts were immediate. The threat to public health was immediate. However, in the overall context, it was short-lived, a matter of a few days. And even though we continued to monitor it heavily for many, many weeks and in subsequent years, the part that sank, the heavy stuff though, was absolutely catastrophic. My recollection is that within the first 2 months of the spill, that Enbridge, per EPA's direction, had recovered over 750,000 gallons of oil from the river, floating on top of the river. So the majority of the oil that was spilled was recovered very early. It was the next 4 years during which we collected the submerged oil. And so to your question, that type of oil was absolutely a factor in the extent of the cleanup, in the extent of the threat to public health, in the cost of responding, and in the overall duration of impact to the community. Just no question about it. And we've learned a lot since then. But with respect to your question about what regulatory changes have ensued, I guess the way I would answer that is that I'm not aware of any regulatory changes that have resulted from that. What has resulted, and I'm sure this will come up later, is the almost universal practice of considering sunken oil or submerged oil in the context of oil spills. This spill was transformational in that respect. Prior to it, it was kind of an out of sight, out of mind thing. If you couldn't see it, it wasn't there. And that's not absolutely the case, but it's much different now. Oil spill response is now characterized universally by looking for fractions of the oil that have become submerged.
Thanks, Ralph. Did anyone else want to weigh in on that question? I was going to switch gears a little bit, if not.
Yeah, I actually do.
Yeah, thanks, Kenneth.
So in the first few days and weeks after the oil spill, as Ralph indicated, the primary risk to public health was the volatile compounds, the diluents that immediately went into the air over the first few days. And the people who had public health problems, who had personal health problems, would then go to medical facilities in our area. And the doctors there would ask them what they were exposed to, and they could only give them the most general answer, the oil spill. But when there was an attempt to find out, well, what was in that material? What were they exposed to? There seemed to be this rule that there was not a right to disclosure of what those compounds were, that this mixture was corporate proprietary property. And I believe that that compounded the difficulty in addressing those public health issues. And I think if that hasn't been addressed on the legislative and regulatory level by now, it needs to be. That this material of hazardous substances cannot be a corporate secret.
Thanks. Ralph and Mozhgon each have their hands up. Mozhgon, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to kind of echo what Kenny had mentioned. As far as I know, that has not changed. Ralph, if you have any knowledge, you're welcome to share that. But that's part of what makes it really difficult is the mixtures of chemicals in this diluted bitumen or dilbit, as well as in a lot of other mixtures of oil, are not disclosed. We don't know what they are. And so when you're trying to figure out what are the health impacts are, you don't know what's in it. And so it makes it really difficult to figure out what those health implications are when you don't know what it is. The state health department did look at, what are the chemicals we see in the oil? So they had to do all of these tests to figure out what are the different types of chemicals that we're seeing and what's the concentrations. That's going to take time. That's not something they had when the spill, like immediately when it happens. And so you then have that delay of understanding what the risks are when you don't know what it is immediately. And so as Kenny had mentioned, it's if you're dealing with the immediate exposures in those first few days, and that's when you really high exposure, but you don't know what that is. And so that lack of transparency makes it really difficult to be able to protect people's health.
Ralph, go ahead, and Beth has her hand up as well.
Thank you. I'd like to follow up on that. So another transformational element of this response relating to the public health impact of the air release, I think this has become much more routine in oil spill response training, in exercises, and in planning to consider air issues associated with oil spills. Now, in the case of Line 6B, the Dilbet had a large diluent component, and the problem with that is that it contains benzene, and the toxicity of benzene is well known, well established, and that I think what we encountered in that response and what the community went through has served to, I think what's resulted is that there's much more attention being paid to monitoring for these toxics during almost any oil spill. We've always known that there are air toxics associated with oil, but it was this extreme case that I think has caused it to be brought to the fore in response planning and preparedness, even though there haven't been regulatory changes that require it. I think it's become much more of a standard operating procedure. And we've also learned that the public health agencies at the local and state level and the federal level need to be involved in emergency response. Similarly, we've learned that local first responders in communities where there are threats like these need to be equipped to appropriately respond. I don't think that was the case in Marshall. I think it's still not the case in many communities. They don't have the special equipment or the training that they need, that we have, And so they're the first ones on scene and they can't get out there. And that goes to the whole evacuation issue that was raised earlier. So I think there's more work to be done there.
Beth, go ahead.
Yeah, and kind of playing off of what Ralph just said, not all spills are created equal. And I think in this situation, because of the emergency order by Governor Granholm at the time, we had a lot more resources come into those communities that were really not prepared at all for something of this size or nature. And there are many spills where there's not the fortunate situation where the EPA and federal agencies are really coming in. What happens is the at-fault party, the pipeline operator in this case, is in charge of response through and through for most situations. And so I think it's just really important to note that response varies considerably based on where it happens and how large it is and where the oil ends up. There's also, I was just mentioned here, there's never been a long-term health study done for the spill. Many of us have mentioned this, but it's such a crucial point. And it's so important to note that benzene levels were being tracked and monitored and detected for a really long time. And those exposures for those people were significant for many of them living right along the river, especially in the lower income communities where they could not escape the situation, or they just didn't have the resources to leave. And so I want to circle this back around to this larger conversation about how we respond to these spills and who should be in charge and who should be leading the cleanup, who should be leading the health impacts. Because right now in the layout where the at-fault party, in this case Enbridge, is calling all the shots, while you have a community that completely doesn't trust the situation at hand and their actions, it really dovetails into a situation of stress, anger, frustration, and we experienced all of that in the weeks following. And I'd also say, just in the same conversation, that a pipeline operator can, in the current regulations, really change the product in their pipeline at any given time, including the chemical makeup of the product. And so this point of really making sure that the material data sheets are made available immediately is crucial. And it's something that, again, has not been addressed in any real significant way from regulation side.
Ralph, do you want to make a quick comment? And we're going to turn a corner here, but go ahead.
Sure. I just wanted to take off on Beth's comment regarding community awareness. That takes us to the issue of contingency planning. The local first responders can't be prepared if they don't understand what the threats are in the community. And that means having an awareness of what's out there. And that is generated by contingency planning, which then ultimately leads back to them figuring out how to have those resources or how to get those resources. And I think that that's a huge takeaway from this event. The general awareness, the networking that could have been in place prior to the event wasn't there. I think that whole thing is much better these days. But you can't overemphasize the importance of planning. And I'm sure Enbridge will be the first to acknowledge that, to the extent that it could have foreseen some of the worst case possibilities here, there are many things it could have done to forestall that and prevent that, and to minimize the extent of the catastrophe. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, and that lack of awareness was an important part of the NTSB report on what contributed to the long interval of time before the spill was discovered. So we're an hour in, and we've got lots of questions from audience members. And before I turn to some of those, I first want to just note for the audience members that please submit your questions via email. questions@pstrust.org. We can only see hands raised of panel members, not members of the audience. So if you have a question, questions@pstrust.org. We've got a lot in the queue already and not a ton of time left. So I'm going to go ahead and turn to the first of them. And that is this. An audience member writes, the leak took place when the river was at flood stage. So oil was well over the banks. And the questioner is wondering how those areas outside the actual river doing 10 years later? And I'm just going to combine that with another question that is related. Enbridge, the questioner notes, got a letter from the EGLE saying that the company's role in the cleanup and restoration is complete. And does that mean that Enbridge is leaving Marshall and the river to other entities now in terms of the cleanup? So a question about the wetlands surrounding, and then a question about Enbridge's continuing or not role in the state of the river and the surrounding areas. Kenneth, go ahead.
Well, so I've said that I spend a lot of time on the river. I see the river banks, I see the river itself, including this area. I am pleased to say that a lot of the restoration work has been relatively successful, that the river itself looks good, feels good. The bottom of the river is mostly sand and gravel with healthy plants, and the vegetation along the shorelines has been set back. In other words, if you remove vegetation, if the vegetation is compromised by the presence of the oil, it will be damaged. And in many cases, it was physically removed. There was one stretch in what was the Ceresco Dam Impoundment. So approximately 10 miles downstream from Talmadge Creek in the Kalamazoo River was a dam, Ceresco. It was a defunct hydroelectric dam. And as part of the cleanup, eventually what they did was remove the dam and work on the impoundment bed. So an impoundment is a lake, a widened area that involves a lot of floodplain eventually. And I will use a non-technical term, but basically it was strip mined to remove an awful lot of the contamination, and it removed all the vegetation, you know, the superficial layers of the banks themselves and the floodplain. And that still looks like it needs a lot of time. I mean, we're really probably talking 25, 50 years before that looks, once again, like a natural river shoreline. But having said that, most of the area actually does look healthy. One frequently will see not only the turtles, which are still unknown what level of compromise in their long-term, you know, the 10, 20, 30-year health of the population is, but you see eagle and osprey there routinely.
Thanks, Kenneth. Mike, did you want to weigh in on the question of Enbridge's continuing role in restoration and cleanup?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Jeff. And as the questioner rightly stated, there is a marker of sorts out there with the no further action report being deemed complete. However, we are committed to ensuring the long-term health of the river. We're not leaving the area. We're not leaving the river. We're there. We have people that live right in Marshall that work every day, currently still working on some invasive species in the sort. And if there is anything that comes up related to the oil spill, we will absolutely be there and remain there with the Kalamazoo River and the Talmadge Creek.
Ken, a quick comment, go ahead.
Well, I'm still part of the stakeholders group that follows the progress of what's been done. So currently it's EGLE, or what used to be the DEQ, who is the lead agency. And there have been continuing investigations, monitoring, additional follow-up and restorations. But essentially of the 40 miles of contaminated river, there have been official no further action. In other words, no additional actions required on the part of Enbridge. For the bulk of that, it is only the last few miles, which is the Moeller Dam. So the last dam at the 40-mile point, more or less, that the impoundment behind that area has been the reports are submitted and they are under review right now. But so I don't know, it's something like, 36 miles, something like that, have actually been issued no further action reports.
Thanks. Question from another audience member that kind of gets to some of Beth's remarks about spill response. And the question says, I understand that the Coast Guard or EPA is often the incident coordinator or leads the response, but does the Coast Guard or the EPA have approval or even some kind of veto authority over spill response plans for pipelines, or are those plans only approved by Fimsa?
Sure, I'll begin on this one. EPA doesn't have any authority or review role when it comes to facility response plans that are prepared by pipeline companies for DOT or for Fimsa, which is an agency within DOT. That said, we do have responsibility at EPA and the Coast Guard to formulate and approve what are called area contingency plans or sub-area contingency plans. And by law, those plans, or by law, facility response plans need to be consistent with EPA or Coast Guard approved area plans. So in that context, there is the opportunity for there to be connectivity. But do we have a direct role in the Fimsa planning? No, the answer is no.
Thank you. Another question, do Fimsa and EPA know enough about Dilbet oil spills and their effect on water to effectively regulate operators' spill response plans? Or should Congress be asked to require further study on those effects to improve Dilbet oil pipeline spill response planning?
I could take a stab at that one, since the National Wildlife Federation has been active in really trying to force Fimsa to look more closely at spill response plans, particularly doing environmental impacts review studies when they receive them. Because currently the procedure that's largely in place by Fimsa is rubber stamping spill response plans as they come in. There's very little engagement and collaboration with communities that are a part of these disaster projects or plans. There's no real communication with tribes. There's no real insight into the environmental impacts. And actually, when a company or an operator builds a worst case scenario or a spill response plan, it's usually dedicated to one particular area, and it doesn't look holistically at the entire length of the line. And so this is something that desperately needs to be considered and reviewed. And to date, Fimsa actually has been fighting us left and right to correct this problem, including legally.
I was going to add to that. I think, research on the health or the impacts to water and ecological health is important, but I think we also need that for human health. If you look at research on toxicity data or toxicity research for human health impacts of products that are used in consumer goods, it's severely deficient. And even those that are in high production use or volume. And I think in this case, there's a high risk from oil spills, as well as in the other processes that involve oil and Dilbet as well, or crude oil. So I do think there is a need for it to be mandated that we actually research and understand these implications of these products that are in pipelines all across the United States and North America.
I think we might have lost Jeff. There's Bill.
I can come in to try to hold space while until Jeff comes back. Let's see. An audience question here. Professionals that operate oil and gas pipelines believe they are performing an essential service to society and adding value to the economy. The persistent challenge articulated by the panelists today is that local communities have a disproportionate exposure to the risks associated with operating pipelines through communities and natural areas. From a local community point of view, other than removing all pipelines, how can this imbalance be balanced?
Yeah, I'll jump in, and I already spoke to it a little bit, but it's first of all transparency from the operator when they're developing a pipeline plan or when they're doing pipeline sitting, to work with communities to consider risks. And oftentimes when a pipeline is going in, there's a lot of conflict happening with communities, and that collaboration and transparency just isn't there. And I think it is on operators as well as oversight agencies to ensure that that's a part of the conversation. The other piece that I would say is, for pipelines that are already existing, I think there needs to be a more robust review process that happens regularly, especially as we're facing a climate crisis and our environment is changing drastically. I think there needs to be some type of trigger in place that requires operators as well as regulators to go back to pipelines, review their locations where there are additional risks growing, and communicate with first responders and local communities to build that transparency and collaboration to ensure that if there is ever a disaster, first of all, people understand the risk and they can activate a response quite quickly. And there should be more resources locally to these communities that have to deal with these pipelines.
Thanks, Beth. And Mozhgon, excuse me.
Yeah, I think one of the things that it doesn't negate the risks. I think it's really hard to fully negate the risks of having a pipeline in your community. But one of the tools that can help, again, not negate, but can help is communities that have policies in place for community benefits agreements, or having companies like Enbridge engage in these conversations where you work with the community and there's kind of a give and take of, are there things that the company can do to kind of relieve or address some of the concerns of the community. So whether or not there are additional or safety emergency plans that the community wants to see. So instead of the company saying, here, we're doing this and this should meet all of your needs, you have the community coming in and saying, these are our concerns. We would like these addressed, right? So I think it involves the community, it's community driven, and usually addresses some additional concerns. Again, risks are not removed, but it does help.
Thanks. Mike, let's hear from you and then let's move on to the next question.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. And I think they're right. It does involve that community, and that's where our focus on stakeholder engagement that I alluded to in some opening comments is so critical. Right to the emergency management coordinator, to the counties, to the cities. It does get down to a resource issue too. There are other opportunities, whether it's area contingency plans and stuff that those local resources can participate on too. Certainly from an Enbridge or an operator's perspective, we desire to get in and have those conversations with those local folks. And there are other opportunities, but again, resource constraints are an issue too.
Thanks. The next question, Mike said he is learning and adopting Anishinaabe 7 grandfather's teachings, but Enbridge continues to occupy and use lands of a tribe without its consent and after a request to leave and cease operation of Line 5. How does Enbridge justify not changing its policy or practice?
Well, again, we are having several conversations with the tribal folks and engaging with them. Again, we have a relationship whereby we need to earn that trust, and that's what we're working on through those conversations. I talked a little bit about the wisdom circles and Pwaganuk folks that I've had discussions with, but we are looking at that not only in Michigan, but across our entire system on the continent, so that we can have those conversations, learn those understandings, and embed those in the decisions and the projects and the operations as we move forward.
Kyle, would you care to respond to that?
Sure. And also linking back to the previous question about some of the values of professionals in pipeline building industries as providing a service to the country. One thing I encourage people to think about is, for Indigenous people, what were our energy systems back in the day? We got energy too, and we had energy systems that lasted for generations. And the United States recognizes 576 tribes as sovereigns and part of the larger family of self-determining governments within the United States. But oftentimes we hear this idea of the energy system of the country. Well, that's one country out of many hundreds that are here. And what about Indigenous energy systems? Would Indigenous people choose fossil fuel-based energy if we were able to continue our ancient energy systems? Would we do it in the same way? And I think there's an assumption that there's just one conception of energy here. And I would encourage people to think, well, who are you actually providing a service for? And how come there's not as much money and resources put into Indigenous people's own projects to develop their energy systems? And Indigenous energy systems, thinking about Anishinaabe culture, are a little bit different. They emphasize consent and reciprocity and trust, and they were doing so from the beginning. And so while I know that companies and corporations, as our colleagues have described, have been learning about some of these values and practices, these are actually baked into our very conceptions of energy. So you couldn't actually have a term for energy that wasn't also at the same time one that meant consensuality or reciprocity. And so these are larger picture concerns that I think are extremely important. And I'd also like to add that there's a big difference between diplomacy and consultation, where there's a veto right, and diplomacy and consultation, which is rather just a sanctioning of infringement. And in other contexts, I've spoken a bit about the nature of a policy that would require companies and governments to consult with Indigenous governments and Indigenous communities. And I think a key thing is that if consultation or diplomacy or any other type of engagement activity is one that's considered either a box to be checked or an activity that will lead to a safer implementation, but that still doesn't reserve the possibility that the project might not happen, then I don't think we've really learned about what consent means, what trust means, what accountability means, what transparency means. And so in cases where you see a pipeline that's been mostly built before formal engagement begins, or you see cases where there's already not a long-term set of relationships that are being built between companies, communities, governments that would in the future make it more possible for people to respond cohesively, then I don't really think that we've learned some of those lessons from Indigenous philosophies, but also the philosophies of other communities that are having to face the situation of living nearby pipelines and other aspects of the energy infrastructure.
Thanks, Kyle, and apologies for losing my connection briefly. We'd gone without any technical glitches until the last 20 minutes of our conversation. I should interject at this moment that we've got a lot of questions, more than we have time to address. And I'm trying to get to some others before our time is up, but we can try to respond through some other channels to some of the additional questions that we're getting, or even follow-ups to some of the conversations that we've already been having. But I want to turn to one other question from an audience member that gets us back to the Dilbet spill into the river. Mr. Dalhoff said that the spill was over 1 million gallons, while Enbridge and the federal pipeline regulator Fimsa will say it was just over 840,000 gallons. I think most of us have heard this dispute over and over. Which is correct, and why are there always so many arguments over the actual amount spilled? Does anyone audit what it is the companies report when it comes to a discharge?
Jeff, we have another person from EPA on the line that I'd like to defer this question to. It's Catherine Garapi, if she's on the line. Catherine is with our Office of Regional Counsel, and she can speak to the issue of the discrepancy between the 843,000 and what we reported. Is Catherine available?
I don't see her in the panelist, and so I'm not sure that she's in.
I just added her as a panelist.
Catherine, are you there?
I am here, yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, super. So I'm one of two staff attorneys who's monitoring Enbridge's compliance with a consent decree that was entered into between the United States and Enbridge in, the consent decree was finalized in May of 2017. I became involved with the case about 6 to 8 months after it was entered. So I know that there was a lot of discussion at the time of the negotiations about the amount that was discharged, and essentially there's EPA alleges in its complaint, which was filed at the same time as the settlement agreement. Oops. Are y'all still there?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, sorry. I lost my screen for a minute. There was a lot of back and forth about the amount, and ultimately the United States alleged a certain amount in the complaint, and then the settlement was resolved at the same time. It's the amount that was spilled is, from a legal perspective, is kind of less important. We know it was a large amount, and so when settlement discussions were underway, that was not so much of an issue for us. What we were concentrating on was the amount of civil penalty that would be paid by the company, which they ultimately paid $62 million in a Clean Water Act penalty. And then it was also, we had some unreimbursed response costs at EPA, so that ended up being about $5.5 billion that the company paid. And probably the largest component of the settlement is the injunctive relief, which is a very unusual consent decree for EPA. Normally, we require cleanup, and we require the responsible party to pay for the cleanup. In this instance, because of the magnitude of the spill and the issues that we became aware of during the cleanup about why it happened, we demanded very extensive injunctive relief. And so the company were very involved at this point with company operations, including their inline inspection program for the entire Lakehead system. We required a data integration database. So when there are pipeline issues, the company can look at one database instead of several. We required the company to implement changes at its control room in Edmonton. And we also have requirements related to Line 5 in the Straits of Mackinac. And we have some requirements related to the closure of Line 6B, and then also replacement of Line 3, which is in Minnesota and Wisconsin. We also have emergency spill response requirements. So the company has been required to put it to do 4 large-scale exercises where they bring out the equipment and coordinate with state and local folks and other federal officials. Some smaller exercises, desktop exercises, community information sessions, spill contingency location information was required to be provided to EPA. So it's very comprehensive. And we actually have 2, myself and another staff attorney at EPA, Matt Russo, we spend probably 80 to 90% of our time working on implementation of the consent decree. And there have been
I should add some changes made to the settlement agreement over time. And also we've had some issues with compliance with Enbridge. And so we have had 2 instances where we've demanded stipulated penalties for what EPA believes were violations of the consent decree. So that is very comprehensive and well underway. And so we're really, at this point, really not so much looking back at how much, how much was spilled, but we're really looking forward and working to change certain aspects of Enbridge's operations. And also this consent decree is an effort to change things in the pipeline industry overall and to push technology and different kinds of pipeline safety and integrity issues within the industry as a whole. So
thank you, Jen. Thank you, Catherine. Sorry to jump in and cut you off. We just have a couple minutes left, and I want to make sure I squeeze in one last question. Before I do, a little footnote from an audience member with the Pipeline Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, that there is a new federal regulation regarding MSDS. It's 49 CFR 195/65. And what it says is that each owner or operator of a hazardous liquid pipeline facility following an accident involving a pipeline facility that results in a hazardous liquid spill must provide safety data sheets on any spilled liquid to the designated federal on-scene coordinator and appropriate state and local emergency responders within 6 hours. So there has been movement there. I wanted to just close up. I wanted to just ask one last question and get Jaynan here. And I wonder if Jaynan could just say a few words regarding your perspective on community impacts. I mean, we're 10 years out. You spoke to how much this changed your life. And I'm wondering, looking back from your vantage now, both in terms of your own personal situation and other community members, what this incident looks like to you.
I'm still healing. I still get a visceral response when I think of what could happen, especially under or with Line 5. But in Marshall, it really split the community. There were those who got more hours at the restaurant because 2,000 more people came, and it didn't affect them. So there was a lack of empathy for those of us who were directly affected, because we all come from our own experience and our own perspectives, and that was hurtful. And I didn't begrudge, the busboy getting more hours, but at the same time, it totally impacted our lives. And I just really don't want it to happen again. I just, it hurts my heart to think that it could happen again. That's it.
Thank you, Jaynan. I appreciate it. And it looks like we're out of time. I want to say thanks to all of you, the panelists. Thanks to the audience members for your great questions. We apologize that there wasn't more time for give and take and for additional questions, but I think we covered some pretty good ground. And I think, as all of us know, these conversations will continue. So thanks to all of our panelists, and thanks to the audience members, and enjoy this beautiful Michigan summer day.
Thank you.
Thanks. Have a great weekend, all.